to you should go to the folder with section that is for section 1 and open all 3 of these files in Sublime or your text editor. And then we'll start section 1. So Daniel.
Yep. All right. So I'm going to be teaching you the basics of HTML and not JavaScript, CSS. You guys can follow along or just watch, but I'm going to assume that you have a text editor, such as Visual Studio Code or Sublime. So if you open up the files, the section 1 file, there should be 3 files inside of it: an HTML file, a CSS file, and a JavaScript file. They should all be in the same folder. So now we are going to start off with setting up our HTML file. So in most text editors, there's a sort of a shortcut that gives you a template for an HTML file. For Visual Studio Code, it's exclamation mark. When you enter, if you press exclamation mark on an empty line and press enter, that'll give you this template. Don't really care about those. And also, I should mention that if you have any questions, feel free to put them in the chat. So you see, now you have this template, and then there's various angle brackets and whatever. So let me explain what those are. So this first line says that it's an HTML document, and here this is an element, an HTML element. It represents the root of an HTML document. Basically, it means it's basically the entire HTML document. It defines the entire HTML document, and it's split up into 2 other elements, which are the body element and the head element. Body element, not and the head element. The body element is where all the stuff that appears on the web page is placed there. So let's refresh the page. It is right. Body, so if we say hello world and save it, refresh the page, and we see that hello world appears on the page. The head element is where all the background content is stored in. Stuff that aren't displayed on the page, but can affect it and modify it. So things such as the title. Well, title is it's what appears on the tab name. So right now it's set to document, and you can see it's document. Let's change that to JS Tetris. Save it, refresh it, and it is now JS Tetris. In the head element, it's also where we put our references to our other files, such as how do I hide this? Okay, so such as our JavaScript files. So we need to reference that. How we do that is by using a script. That's not how you spell it. A script element. And oh, I should mention, each element consists of a start tag and an end tag. The start tag is just the element name in 2 angle brackets. The end tag has a slash in it, and that defines the start and the end of an element. So in order to import our JavaScript file, we need to type in script. This is the element that can reference JavaScript files. Then we give an attribute Because we are referencing an external file, we need to give an attribute called src, which stands for source. Source, if it's in the same folder, you could just put it in the file name, and it should be referenced. Then we also need to reference our styles, our CSS file. To do that, what we do, we use the link tag, and this is somewhat different because it's only a tag. There's no end tag on with the link. So what we do is we type href, which searches for the URL of the document that you want to import or reference. So in this case, it's style.css. Type that in. For this tag, something special is that you need to also put in the relationship called rel to this document. So I believe it's relationship, and the relationship is a style sheet. So we just put that in, and there's our head element, and that's basically all for everything that's for the background stuff. Now let's go on to explaining the body elements and the things that appear on the screen. One of the most common elements, body elements that you might see is something called the heading elements. So it goes from 1 to 6, and each of those represents a different font size. So let's say hello world. And I should I should have a hello world or reference as well. Save it, and you can see we have the old hello world. It's in plain text, and each one says hello world in bold colors and in a larger font size. Then another common element is the div element. This element is it stands for division, and it's a very important element, as it is a generic container that has no special properties. And why is it so important? It's because there's no special properties. And because of that, it allows you to actually group elements together and modify them in an easier way. So if we were to put, for example, put hello world, save it, refresh the page, see that nothing special happens. The power of the div comes from when we start styling stuff and doing JavaScript stuff. So let's go into let's start talking about the CSS. I did say CSS before, right? So what CSS stands for is cascading sheets, style sheets, and it basically allows you to modify or style your HTML elements. So what we can do is, well, let me explain the syntax first. So for a CSS file, you have a selector and curly brackets. This selector, what this selector is, it's whatever elements that you want. So this is not actually selector, but let's say we want divs. We want to modify divs or style divs. So if we want to style divs, we put div in the selector spot. Then these are the declarations where we can modify the properties. So for example, we could change the border from 5, because right now there aren't any borders. And if we write this, what we're saying is that for every single div inside this HTML document, apply a border to it. Save, refresh the page, and now you can see that the div has a style applied to it. It has a border, this applied to it. Sometimes we will have multiple divs. Let's say, let me just copy and paste something I created earlier. Let's say we have multiple divs, like, not the IDs. We'll get to that in a bit. Let's say we have multiple divs, and we want to only highlight box 1. How we can't really just say, oh, div, we should apply this style to all the divs, because it applies it to every div, and now all the boxes have a border around it. What we can do is use IDs and classes. So what are, well, first off, what are IDs? Well, an ID is a unique identifier that is unique for every single HTML document. So you can't have two of any element with the same ID. So let me just paste this, and I'll give you an example as to how you could style with it. So now what I did was I decided to give each div or each box its own ID. So we get box 1 gets first, second, third, fourth. Now let's say we want to have a border around box 1. Let's save this. If we refresh it now, all the boxes still have the same border, but that's because we are saying every div should have a border. But now what we can do, because we have the IDs, we could using CSS, we could specify that we should only apply this to a specific class or ID. So to specify it, we use a pound symbol and the ID's name. So now every element, each element with an ID of first will have this applied to it. Save it, and now only box 1 has it. Classes are sort of the same thing, except they are more general, I guess. Let me just create a div. Here's something I created with different classes. Classes are very similar to IDs, but the thing is you can have multiple classes as well. You can have multiple classes as well as multiple elements can have the same class. So for example, odd appears twice in 2 classes, and even appears in 2 classes. Then there's also 1, 2, 3, 4, shows that we can have 2 classes at once. Now to select classes, and let me just save this. To select classes, it's sort of similar to the ID. Instead of the pound, we use a dot. And now we could say dot even and we will apply a border for every even box, so 2 and 4. There we go. Because we can put in multiple classes, we can also put in multiple styles. So let's say we also want box 2. No, let's say we want the even boxes to all have a black border. But for box 2 only, we want a specific width and height. We could do that using the width property, and we could change that to 100 pixels and make sure you put a semicolon at the end, and we could change its height to 100 pixels as well, and we can make it square. By default, divs span the entire width of the page, but now we have specified a specific width and a specific height. And if we refresh it, see that this box is an actual square, while box 4 is still spans the entire width. One thing that you should note is that we can have divs inside of divs. So for example, you can have div and then div. And this is completely valid and very useful for when we are actually working on our workshop. Let's give an example. So there's something, wait, whoops, wrong thing. Here's something that I made, copy and pasted it. Note, this is just an example, so no need to actually type this out. But as you can see, in this case, we have, refresh, let me just remove the styles first so we can see what it actually is. In this case, we have a div of box 1, and inside of it, there's sub boxes instead of other divs, and this goes the same for all 3. And these big boxes have IDs, while these smaller boxes have classes. Let's say we want to put a border around all these sub boxes. We can't just do div, because what will happen is that it will highlight all the boxes. As you can see, box 1 has it's highlighted. Because box 1 also includes the sub boxes, it goes around all the sub boxes, and all the sub boxes have their own box as well. Let's say we want to only have boxes around the sub boxes. How can we do that? Well, CSS has this special feature. What you do is in the selector, you first have the first element that you want, then put a space, then type in the other elements that you want. So what this means is that we are looking for a div, and that div has to be inside another div. So it means that this div, the second div, must be inside another div. Save that and refresh, and all the sub boxes has a border around it. We could apply the same tips and tricks with the IDs and classes here as well. So instead of every single div, I only want to highlight, let's say, the even number, the even divs. So subbox 2 and subbox 4 for every single box. So we do this. Now only the elements with the class of even inside of divs will be highlighted, as you can see. We can also do the same for the first one. Let's change that to the first one. So right now, it's only elements with a class of even inside elements with an ID of first. So it's only subbox 2 and subbox 4. Let's see how this code is applied in our finished product. Section 9 here. This is our complete version, and as you know, you could download this. It should be downloaded along with all the other files. And so, as you can see, the head is basically the same. This is the completed HTML document. So the head is basically the same, but for the body, there is a header 3. Header 3, that just means it's a smaller size than header 1, I should say. Header 1 to 6, so like header 1 is like the largest, while header 6 is the smallest. There's H3 span. It's sort of like a div, but it's inline, so it's great when you have text that you want to edit. You can see there's the ID that we use. There's also button, which is somewhat self-explanatory because you press it and it does stuff. And there's also the divs. This is actually where I believe this is actually basically the game. So there's this div, main grid. It will be what this will be. So basically the play space, and their mini grid, which is the next up block. And as you can see, there's IDs. And we styled this using what I explained before. So we used pound main grid, which means find the ID of main grid and apply these properties, such as height of 400 pixels, width of 200, background color. That's just sets the background color, but there's a lot of properties that you can modify. If you want to search it up, you can go to W3 Schools, and under the CSS section, it's very comprehensive. You can find a lot of things. See here, main grid div. So every single div inside main grid. If you actually look here, there's nothing inside, but that's because in our JavaScript file, we will be creating all the divs. And we apply specific properties for those divs. Same here for the mini grid, for the div. And you guys can check out the rest. Though I should say that just don't think too much about this line. It just imports specific font for our H3. That's why it's this nice color. So that's basically it for HTML and CSS. Guess I'll be passing it off to let's see, Edward for your JavaScript.
Okay, hey guys. And I'm gonna need you to stop sharing your screen.
How do I stop sharing?
Oh, actually, no, sorry, I can just override yours.
Okay.
Okay, cool. So next we're gonna be going over sections 2 to 4. So hopefully you've got that downloaded. I'm gonna be working in the incomplete version. The complete version just contains all of the completed exercises. So here, as you can see, the index.html and style.css files are the same as when Daniel left them. We're going to be working in app.js. Obviously, this is not the same as when he left it. His was blank. So hopefully, this shouldn't be too overwhelming because I'll be going over everything in this page. So let's get started with an introduction to JavaScript variables. So I'm assuming that most of you guys are in engineering. So you guys should have done Python, I think, in first semester. But if not, variables are essentially just data that you can store under a name. In JavaScript, there are 3 different keywords we can use to define variables: var, let, and const. So there are 3. These 3 are all have different functionality. So for var, when you define a variable using var, you scope that variable to the function that it's in, which means if I have a variable that I define by var within a function, I cannot use that variable outside of that function. Whereas for let and const, they're scoped to the block that they're defined in. And a block is essentially, as you can see here, it's a snippet of code that falls between these 2 curly braces here. So any variable that you define with let or const, if you define them within a block, you cannot use them outside of the block. They don't exist outside of the block. And const is different from let in that when you declare a variable with const, you're declaring a constant variable, which means that you cannot reassign the variable to another value. One thing to point out is that later on when we declare a constant array, while you cannot redefine the variable to another array, you can change the data within the elements of the array. And I'll go over that later on. So first, let me show you guys how these work. A quick little demo. So here we have console.log. What this essentially does, it's similar to, well, it's the same thing as the print statement in Python or system.out.println in Java. And it basically allows us to output things that we do in our code. So here I'm going to be logging console.logging x1, x2, and x3, which I've defined by var, let, and const respectively, to the name of the keyword that we use to define them. So in order to see the output here, let's save this here. And then if we open up the HTML file, and then we right click anywhere on the page, click inspect, we should see this little window pop up. And then in this window, we can click console to see the console. So this is where we output our x1, x2, and x3 here in these 3 lines. You can see that it outputs var, let, and const exactly as we want. So I want to show you guys the difference between variables and constants. So first, if I were to try to redefine or redeclare x1 and x2 to different values, I'm setting them to changed var and changed let. If I save this and then refresh the page, you can see it becomes changed var, changed let. And let me show you what happens when I try to change the constant variable x3. And I refresh the page. It gives me an uncaught type error, assignment to constant variable. So as you can see, JavaScript does not allow me to change the constant variable that I defined earlier. So now I want to show you guys how scoping works. So as you can see, x2 and x3 are defined by let and const, which means that they're scope defined. Sorry, they're block scoped, which means that they should not be able to exist outside of this block. If we try to do console.log x2, save, refresh, it gives me an uncaught reference error. X2 is not defined. The same thing should happen when we try to console.log x3, refresh the page, x3 is not defined. And x1, if we do the same with x1, which is defined by var, we should see that it does work. And this is because that we defined x1 with var. And because x1 is not defined within a function declaration, it's essentially globally defined. So we can use x1 anywhere in this JavaScript file. So up next, let's talk about the different types of variables. There's actually a lot of different data types in JavaScript, and you can find out more at this link here. Let me see if I can get to chat here. If you go to this link, you can find out more about JavaScript types. It goes pretty in depth, but because in this workshop we're going to be focusing on numbers, booleans, and arrays, I will only be talking about those. So in JavaScript, we have something called numbers. I'm sure in Python you're familiar with having integers and real numbers. But in JavaScript, all numbers are of the same type, a number. So a number will be an integer if you set it to an integer, and it will be a floating point number if you set it to a floating point number. So let's say, for instance, I wanted to declare a variable x and set it to the value of 1. And then if we were to log this out, we should see 1. If we change this to 1.5, a floating point number, and we print out x, we get 1.5. So numbers are dynamic in JavaScript. They're both integers and floating point numbers. Boolean values are true or false. You might have seen from Python or other computer science classes. And then before I get to arrays, I want to talk about loops, because loops and arrays kind of go hand in hand. There are two types of loops, the while loop and the for loop. A while loop will take a condition as its parameter here within these brackets, and then it will execute this loop body as long as this part holds true. So one way to read this is while this part is true, do this. One thing to note with while loops is that because of the condition here, you may be able to run your loop infinitely, which is usually bad. So make sure that you have a way to terminate the loop. As you can see here, defining a variable I and setting it equal to 100. And I want to run this code as long as I is less than 110. So I will be logging the value of I to the console, and I'm also going to increment I by 1. So what that means is I'm going to increase the value of I by 1 every time we get to this line. So hopefully by the time I gets to 109, the next time it runs, it will not run because the condition is no longer true. 110 is not less than 110. So if I save this and then refresh the page, I print out 100 all the way to 109. Now, next we have the for loop, which is similar to the while loop, except it has 3 different parameters that you need to fill in. First is the start point. Next is the condition. And then because of how frequently we use an increment with while loops, we have the increment in the header here of the for loop. So this is essentially the same as the while loop in that we want to start a number at some value, we increment it, and then we want to execute the loop body as long as this condition is true. So in this case, we're starting at 0, and we want it to run as long as I is less than 10. So let's see what this logs to the console. 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. Perfect. So back to arrays. Arrays are objects which can hold multiple pieces of data and also different types of data. So similar to how in Python there's lists, which can hold integers, strings, booleans, all in the same array. In JavaScript, you can have an array consisting of different data types. So here, we're declaring an array, a constant array with the following data: a string, a string, a string, a string, a string, and then 3 numbers. So indexing an array begins at 0, which means that the first element is actually considered the 0th element by JavaScript. And if we want to access one of these data, we can use square brackets next to the name of the array, like this. So if we wanted to log the third string here, which would be dogs, we do console.log and then array and then 2 because 0, 1, 2. So let me just show you guys that. There it shows dogs in the console. Then next, the reason that I wanted to teach loops with arrays is because they work hand in hand together. Here we have a for loop that starts with 0 and it increments by 1. We want this to run as many times as there are elements in the array. So array.length is a built-in method of an array, which basically returns the number of items that are in this array. So here I want to log array, and we can use the variable I, which is going to represent each index as it increases through the loop. So if we run this, we should be logging all of the items in the array. So one thing that I want to show you is that we can actually change the data within the array, even though we declared it as a constant. We cannot reassign the array, but we can change the different data within the array. So here, I'm going to be setting the third item to snakes instead of dogs, and the fifth element to ladders instead of cats. And once again, we're just going to print out the whole array. And there we go. It's raining snakes and ladders. So next, for about 5 minutes, I'm going to ask you guys to complete this following exercise. I want you to try declaring an array with the following elements, strings, I'm making Tetris today, and then exclamation mark. I want you guys to log the word Tetris in the console. I want you to change the name I'm to whatever your name is, using like the notation we have here. And then lastly, I want you to make a for loop and then log out everything to the array. I'll give you guys until 2:50 to do this. And if you're stuck or need help, you can ask in the chat, or you can refer to the complete version, which has the solution to the exercise here. So I'll give you guys about 5 minutes. I'll be answering questions in the chat if there are any. I'm gonna actually just work through the exercise right now.
Oh yeah, it'd be nice if you guys, when you're done, just type that in the chat so we have a good sense of whether or not you guys are ready.
Okay, so I should be done. Let me save and then check here. And there we go. That should be everything. It's not quite 250 yet, but I think I could probably get started with the next content. So next, I'm going to talk about functions in JavaScript. So in JavaScript, we use functions to perform a specific task. And because we might not know how many times we want to perform this specific task, we use a function so that every time we want to perform the task, we can just call upon the function to do the task. So here's a short little demo of how to define and declare a function in JavaScript. We use the keyword function. We have the name of the function. And then here we have a list of the parameters that we're going to use within the function. I'll explain what that means in a second. And then inside the curly brackets, we have the block of text that is essentially executed when we call the function. So in this function called hello, every time we call this function, we want to pass in a name. And then every time we run the function, we want to log my name is, and then the name that you passed into the function. So for example, if I was to call hello on the string Calvin, if I refresh this, it should print out my name is Calvin, but it's not. So I want to change this to Edward, right? And then this time when I call the function, it should print out my name is Edward. And there we go. So that's how you define functions in JavaScript. One thing to note is that we might use a different notation later on. To clarify things, these two function declarations are the same. So earlier we did function, function name, list of parameters, and then the function body, like this. Another way that we define functions in JavaScript is using what's called the arrow notation. And essentially it looks like this. We have the list of parameters. We have equal greater than sign to form like an arrow. And then we just have the function body. This is a simplified and anonymous way to declare a function so that we don't really need a function name. Okay, so that's the introduction to JavaScript. Next, I'm going to go over how to edit the HTML here in JavaScript, because as you know, we need a grid, a main grid and a mini grid. So we're going to be using JavaScript to create our 10 by 20 grid and our 4 by 4 grid for the mini grid. So first of all, I need to talk about the HTML DOM. So what does DOM mean? DOM stands for Document Object Model. And essentially, it's like this tree system that, as you can see here, it's a tree of objects that JavaScript basically references every time we want to interact with the HTML document itself. So the main document is called document. And now we're going to talk about how to interact with HTML. To access an element, we use document.getElementById, and then we put in the name of the ID of the element. So if, for example, we wanted to get an element with the ID game end, for example, let's say we wanted the Tetris heading here, we would do get element by ID and then game end, which is the ID that we set to this element. To create an element, we use document.createElement and then the type of element in the parentheses here. So for example, if we want to create a div, we can use document.createElement and then we put in brackets and quotations div. So next we're going to talk about how to append or remove an element. So appending just means basically adding an element to as a child of another element. So let's say we have an element B and we want to add an element A underneath element B or like within element B. We use this notation here, element B dot append child and then element A. So similarly to remove an element, we do element B dot remove child and then element A. So for example, you can see here, if we were to have an element B from the HTML document, we would get it with document get element by ID, element B. And then we create an element A such that it's a div. And then here element B, with element B, we can append to it element A so that element A is a child of element B, which basically means that it's like within element B. So next, we're going to talk about how to add and remove classes. So like we mentioned earlier, classes are used to style elements. We use the dot here to style everything that has the cyan class, for example. So to interact with the classes, we use the name of the element and then class list add, and then we add the name of the class. Similarly, we use element name class list remove name of the class. And then as an example, if we wanted to add a class villain to the element Joker, we do Joker class list add villain. So next, an important topic we need to talk about is the event listeners. An event listener executes a function when a specified event occurs on the element that it's attached to. So a common event is DOM content loaded, which refers to when the contents of the whole HTML document have been loaded and are displaying. So to add an event listener, we use this following notation: document dot add event listener, or actually it's the name of the element dot add event listener, and then we have the event separated by a comma, and then we put the function here. So as you can see here, the function is in the same arrow notation that I introduced above. You can also pass in a function just like this, like with the other function notation. However, we're going to be using this notation later on. So this event listener is attached to the whole document itself, which is why we use document instead of an element. The document itself is sort of an element, as we can see here in the DOM. It's right here. It's like the root element. So another common event that we frequently use in JavaScript is click, and that refers to when the attached element is clicked. So for example, if we want to make some code run when element A is clicked, we would just have an event listener that looks like this: element A dot add event listener click, and then a function here to run some code. So here I'm actually going to do a quick little demo on an event listener. I'm going to be adding an event listener, a click event listener to the start button, which is this button here. And I'm going to grab it using get element by ID start button, which is the name of the ID of the button. So I do start button dot add event listener click, and then inside I have this function where I log the string start button pressed. Save this, refresh the page. So there's nothing logged out to the console yet, but every time I click start button, it will tell me that the start button is pressed. I can click it a bunch of times. It'll tell me every time it is clicked. If there's any questions that you want to get answered, you can ask us, or you can visit this link regarding the HTML DOM. This goes pretty in depth into how JavaScript and the HTML interact. So finally, we're going to create our 200 divs so that we can have our grid here. First, we're going to use a for loop, obviously, because if we want to do something 200 times, it's easier to do it once, multiplied by 200, instead of actually doing it 200 times, like typing out 200 times. So here we have a for loop. We start it at 0. We start I at 0, and then we increment it by 1. And then we want it to run as long as I is less than 200. So what happens in this for loop is we declare a block as a new element, a new div, and then we want to append this div as a child of the main grid here. So when I do document.getElementById main grid, that refers to this div here, and then when I append to the child, when I append to main grid's child block, it essentially does this. And it adds a div as a child of the main grid div. And then, so that's that creates the 200 div grid, which is 10 by 20. Next, I want to create a div or create a row of squares down here to signify that a taken row. And essentially what this does is it creates like a floor so that when the pieces reach the bottom, it knows to stop and like not fall forever. So we're going to create another row of 10 divs, which is what this for loop is for. And then we're going to give each square a class of taken, which we'll be using later on as well. This is similar to the for loop here. And then for this next up display, we want to make a 4x4 grid. I'm going to be leaving that as an exercise for you guys. I'll give you 5 minutes to create 16 divs, 4x4. It's really similar to this right here. I'll be taking this up in maybe 3 minutes. So if you guys need help, feel free to ask a question or refer to the complete version where it's already done for you. You guys have been asking really good questions so far. Keep them coming, especially if you're stuck or confused on anything. Thirty more seconds until I show you guys how it's done. Okay, cool. So, pro tip when you're doing anything with coding, copy paste. So I'm just gonna copy and paste this. So we want to make a 16 div grid, which means that instead of making 200 divs, I just want to make 16. I'm gonna let the block, or I'm gonna just do the exact same thing here, except I make 16 of them instead. And instead of appending it to the main grid, I want to append it to here, as we can see here, the mini grid div. So in here, I will change it to mini grid. And then that's it. That's that. So next, I'm going to skip over the variables part because these variables are going to be used in later sections. My last section is to talk about how to create the tetrominoes. Most of the tetrominoes have already been made for you. It's going to be an exercise for you to create the L tetromino after I explain how these tetrominoes are created. So if we take a look at this picture here, we have 7 different tetrominoes. And basically to create them, we're going to be creating the shapes. And later on, we'll be applying color to them so that we can distinguish them. Each tetromino has 4 different rotations. Some of them are repeated. For example, the square is each rotation of the square looks the exact same. So we don't actually have to change anything for that. So here inside each tetromino, we have an array of arrays of numbers. The big array represents contains the 4 different rotations, and that's what each one of these arrays are for. Each array is contains the grids of one of the rotations. So what width is how wide our grid is going to be, which is 10. So when we have width here in the array, what it means is, let me find it. What it means is we go down by 1 row, basically. So if our current position is this red circle here, and we have a width in the array, essentially we're moving it down by 1 row exactly, because there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 squares until we get to the next row. So that's essentially what each array symbolizes. So we're going to be going through creating the L-shaped tetromino, which is the orange one here. I'll give you guys a bit of time to create it right now, and then I'll be working through it with you guys in just a few minutes. Remember that each array consists of 4 arrays, each of them representing a rotation, which you can see this picture here. Okay, so when in creating the L tetromino, for the first rotation, let's just do this one. We can see that if we take the top left square to be our current position, we want it to be 1 to the right of our current position. So 1, and then 1 below that, which would be 1 plus width, and then 1 below that, so 1 plus width times 2, and then 1 to the right of that. So it'd be 2 plus width times 2. And then for the second rotation, let's just choose this one. We want it to be colored 2 to the right, so 2, and then 1 below, so width, 1 to the right of that, width plus 1, and then 1 to the right of that, so width plus 2. For the next rotation, let's just do this one. First, we want it to stay on the current grid, so 0, and then 1 to the right, 1 below that, so 1 plus width, and then 1 below that, 1 plus width times 2. And then for the final rotation, we have this one. So it's on the next row. So we do width plus 1, width plus 2, and then 2 rows below, so 2 times width. And so one last thing I want to mention is that once we have all of the tetrominoes created here, we have another array to put all of the different pieces inside. And then we also have an array with their corresponding colors, as you can see here. And that's it for creating the tetrominoes. I'm going to be passing it on to Corbin.
All right, thank you. I'm going to just share my screen and we can get started. Okay, so in this section, it is section 5 and 6. So what we're going to do is take everything that Edward and Daniel showed us, and I've compacted it down to just the bare bones, and then we're going to have some additions. So let's get started. So we are defining a variable current position to be 4, and that is basically our reference point, as Edward was explaining, and then the current rotation to be 0. And current rotation would be the index of one of these 4 arrays in the large tetromino. And next, we're going to be choosing which random tetromino to select. So we're using math.random, which returns a random number between 0 inclusive and 1 exclusive, and then we're multiplying it by the length of this array right here. And so that's gonna, this will output a number between 0 and approximately 6.93. And then we are using math.floor, which returns a random integer less than or equal to a given number. So it, in our case, it just gets rid of the decimals. And then next random, we're doing the same thing. So we are letting the color that the tetromino is going to be the random index in this array of colors, and then the current tetromino that we're on be random tetromino from this array, and then the random current rotation. So say it selected this one, and then the current rotation would be 0, so it'd select this. So now we're going to do a little activity, and we're going to log the color and the current tetromino that's selected. So I'm just going to comment out the rest because we don't need that. And then copy and paste that. And then if we save that and we go into our file here, we should be able to see. Oh, here. That's what matters. So we have a random one that's selected every time. There we go. So I will go back. So now we're going to do drawing the tetromino. And so we're going to make use of for each. So basically we have our current array, and then for each index in that array, we're going to do something to it. And In this case, we're going to add a color. So basically, for those these positions that we decided randomly, we are going to color those, and that's what makes it appear. So now we're going to do draw little activity and see if it actually draws something. There we go. And now it's starting to fall because I have more code underneath. So we'll see, we'll check that out now. So let's just get rid of that. So now is undraw, because we will need to undraw it later. And that's basically doing the same thing except removing this class color. And in case it wasn't clear, this color is from up here, which is the random color from this array, which corresponds to one of these colors. So it is actually formatting those specific divs that we chose randomly and applying that color. So now we're going to go to the freeze function, which in summary, if one of the tetrominoes lands on just above a taken, then it will become taken. So we're going to use sum, which returns true if any of the arguments in here are true. So we're going to take our array current, and then if the position plus the index plus the width, so a row lower than that index, is taken, then we're going to make, for every index, we're going to make it taken. And then we're going to do random is the next random, and then we're getting a new next random using math.floor, math.random. And then we're setting the current tetromino to the new random and the same rotation. And then we're setting our current position to be 4, which is back up at the top. And then we're setting the color to also the new random. And then we're going to draw this tetromino at the top. Okay, moving on now to section 6. We're going to define a few functions, all which undraw, change a couple things, and then redraw it. So starting with move, so pretty straightforward. So we're going to undraw it and then change the current position to plus equals width, and then so that's making it 1 row lower. And then we're going to redraw it and freeze just to check to see if it is touching any taken, and that will make it taken if it is. So now we're going to use set interval, which basically calls this function move down every second. So if I want to demo this, it basically moves down every second. So you can see it's moving down a whole row every second. And once it hits the bottom, it will stop because all these, as we talked about before, are taken underneath. Perfect. And then it draws another, sets the current position to the top, and draws another, and repeats. But now we want to move it around. So that's what we're going to do. So I'm going to define a function move left. And so first we're going to undraw it, and then we're going to see if it's at the left side already. Because if it is at the left side, we don't want to move it left more because it can't. So this is basically if some of the indexes or the divs are touching the left side, or current position plus index, which is its position on the whole board, modulus the width, so the remainder is 0, which just basically means it's at the left, then it will be true. So, and that's again if any of them are true. So if it's not at the left, we're going to subtract 1 from the current position. And if this new position has a tetromino already there, or if some of the index are taken, then it's going to move it back right to where it was before. And then it will draw it. So now I'm going to do a little activity. You guys are going to try and make the move right, which is very similar to this one. It's just the positions change up a little and figuring out where the right side is. So this part will change a little. So I encourage you to do that. And if you guys have any questions, please let me know. So I'm going to take it up in 1 minute, then we can move on to rotate. Okay, so I'm gonna copy it from the complete file, and then I will explain it. So it's very similar. First, we're gonna undraw it, and then we're gonna see if it's at the right side. So to do this, same concept as before. If any of the divs are at the right side, then it would return true, and that's the only difference here is that the remainder would be width -1. So if it's not at the right side, it's going to increase the position, and if there was something already there, it's going to subtract the position back to where it was before, and it's going to redraw it. So now we're going to move to rotate. So first we're going to undraw it, then we're going to define our at right and at left. And if it's not at the right side or at the left side, the current rotation is going to increase by 1. And now if the current rotation is 4, that means it is too high because remember, current rotation is an index of one of these arrays. So we have 0, 1, 2, 3. So if it's 4, we're just going to set it back to 0. And then we're setting our current tetromino to random and then current rotation, which was changed in this function. And then we're going to draw and then freeze to check if when we turned it, it has touched something taken. So now we're going to actually use these functions based on our keyboard inputs. So I'm going to define a function control, and it's going to say if the key code is 37 or 65, which is left arrow A, it's going to call move left. If it's right arrow or D, it's going to move right. And then now this is going to be a little activity for you guys to see which, use this link that I'm going to post in the chat, and then we're going to see which key codes are up arrow or W and down or S. So I will leave that to you guys, and then we can take it up in just 1 minute. So you go to that website, and then you click to see which one it is. Okay, so if you went to that website, you would find out that these are the values. Yep, so that's pretty straightforward. Now I'm going to tell you how this function is called. So we're doing an event listener key up, which calls this function control if a key is released, and it automatically passes which key into this function. So now we have all of these ready, and I can do a demo. So now we should be able to move it left and right, and then if we hit up arrow, we can rotate it. And so that's all from me, other than remember we need to comment out this set interval because we'll be doing some more logic in terms of when it moves down in the next section. So yeah, I move it on to Calvin.
Okay, so I'm gonna need you guys to open up the incomplete version files for section 7 and 8. And I will share my screen in a second. So if you guys want to see what the so up to when Corbin did his, it should be something like this. It starts automatically. The start pause button doesn't do anything, and there's no mixed up display. So what we're going to do is we're going to make the start pause button. Okay, if you guys see section 8, section 7 is actually below section 8, so we're going to do the next up display afterwards. But the way that we're going to make the start pause button work is that instead of what Corbin did with this set interval move down and then sometime, we're going to comment that out. And so he might have already explained it, but set interval takes two parameters, a function and a number in milliseconds. And every that number of milliseconds, the function will be called. But there's no way to, if you just call it as is, there's no way to cancel it. So we need to set that set interval to a variable. We need to declare it in a variable like this. So this would run the function play alarm every 2000 milliseconds or 2 seconds. And this would play alarm every 2 seconds, right? Play alarm is an actual function, it's just an example. So once we set this to a variable, we can, so what happens is set interval, if you set it to a variable, it will return the value, which is, it will return a value which is the name of the timer's ID. So the timer is the thing that makes it go every 2 seconds. So the name of that ID is what it returns. And if you have that, what you can do is you can use another function called clear interval. And if you put that timer inside clear interval, it will get rid of that timer and the function will stop running. So what we're going to do is when you hit the start button, you will set the, so if you declare it inside a variable, this will still run. So we're going to set timer to set interval whenever we hit start. And then whenever we hit like the start pause button again, it's going to clear that timer so that the game stops running. And I'll show you how we're going to do that. So down here where it says start, we're going to have an event listener that listens to when the start button is clicked. If you guys don't remember what start button is, it is a constant we declared like this earlier, where we document.querySelector found the element with the ID start button, which is our start pause button. And so whenever that's clicked, we're going to run this function in here, which right now we haven't written yet. So we're going to put, for example, not for example, but like this, exactly this. I think earlier we declared a variable called timer ID, named this, and we're gonna set this to set interval. And so once the button is clicked, that this will run, and that will start the game. So instead of the game running automatically, it'll run when you hit the start button. But then we also need to implement a pause. So what we're gonna do is, since it's the same button, we're gonna put if timer ID. And so if timer ID has a value, like it returns a value, and this does return a value, it returns the ID of the timer, then we will, if the game is, basically that means if the game is already running, we will clear the timer. And then we will set timer ID to null. Null is basically false or zero. It's equivalent. I have this whole section on booleans right here if you want to read it, but there's a lot of values that are equal to false. And so basically, if once timer ID is null, then this, when you click it again, it'll say if this is true, and it won't be true, it'll be false. So it will instead do this in the else. And in the else, we'll set timer ID equal to set interval. So basically, if you read this, it's like if the game is already running, if timer ID already exists, then pause it by clearing the interval, or else just start the game, is how you would read that. Let's see. So next, that's all you really need to do for the start button. At the end of the workshop, if you guys want to stick around, we'll put some other stuff in here, maybe like add music in here, so that when you push the start pause button, it'll also play music. But right now we'll start the next up display. So the next up display, if you guys remember, like for width, we had 10, right? Because the, let's see, because this width is 10. It's 10 across, but this next up display is 4 by 4, which means it has a width of 4. So we're gonna set m width or mini width to 4. And we're gonna make tetrominos again, except this time, instead of having all the rotations, we're just going to have one of the rotations. It doesn't matter which one, because we don't need to rotate things on the next up display. So I'll give you guys a few minutes to make that, and I will show you how to do it in 3 minutes, maybe less. Okay, so I assume you guys have worked on that. For the O tetragonal, it's just the first square and then the one next to it, and then the same two below it on the next row. So that's what this is. You guys might have used different orientation, but as long as you think that it works, it probably will. But this is one of these possible solutions. It will look exactly the same as the orientations that we did before, except it's m width instead of width, because we have a width of 4 instead of 10. So this is a good way to see if you guys know how to select HTML elements from the JavaScript file. So try finding the mini grid element using JavaScript, and then try, so for many squares, we did something called squares earlier. We made an array after finding all the elements that are inside the mini grid. So try this out, and I'll give you like another 2 minutes for that. So for that question, the reason why we use m-width, which is 4, instead of width, which is 10, is so like for when you know, let me show you the picture. So when we draw this tetromino, we have a position, right? So if we have index 1, this will draw the next block on here. If we have the index of width, it will go, because we have width of 10, it'll go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, and it'll go here, right? But since our smaller, like our next up display is only 4 wide, like it will only have to go like 1, 2, 3, 4, and then draw on the, like here, right? Does that make sense? Okay, cool. Okay, so if you guys probably figured this out, but we just go document.query selector. And this will return everything that has this, which is the ID of minigrid. The pound sign here is for ID. If it was a class, then it would be dot. And then the way we find all of the elements that are inside the minigrid and are a div is by doing this. So this looks for everything that is a div inside the element with the called the minigrid, with the ID minigrid. And then in order to make this, because this returns multiple divs, right? This returns like all the divs for that are inside minigrid. We make an array out of them. And when we use this array that we made to index. And then we will set the we will set this new variable next to mtetros next random. So after next random is generated, it will pick like a random number in from 1 to 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. So like 0 to 6. And this will be one of these things because it's taken out of this. Because this is an array of these tetrominos. So this will represent your next tetromino. Now, earlier we did a draw and undraw function. And so the draw function adds color to each of the squares at these indexes. And then the undraw function removes the color class from the squares at those indexes. What we're going to do for mini draw, because we can do it in one step. We're just going to combine all these two functions. So for mini draw, we're going to go next, which is the next tetromino for each, which means for everything inside next. So everything inside next, inside these tetrominos is an index. So we're going to use that index for each of these indexes. We're going to do this function. And we're going to uni squares dot, oh, so at the index of that inside mini squares, we're going to look at the class list of that div and then remove it. And that is our undraw function. So we're just gonna like get rid of it. And if there's nothing there, there's nothing to get rid of. So we're all good. And then we'll set next to the next tetromino. And then we will set next color to the next color. And then we will redraw, after we've set it to the next tetromino and the next color, we will redraw like the next we'll draw the next tetromino onto the mini grid. So next dot for each. This is almost exactly the same as the undraw. That's where's dot class list. Instead of remove, we're just going to have add. And that is how we will do our next up display. And so once all of this is implemented, we will put mini draw inside of our freeze function, so that when I already put it here, but so this means that whenever a block hits the ground, and that's the only time the new next block will fall down, right? Then we'll undraw the old next block and redraw the new next block. The only problem here is on the first block, well, no block has hit the bottom yet. So we'll need to call mini draw once before then. So we'll go over to where we made our start button. And so earlier we declared a, or we will declare, we can just declare it here actually. We can have a variable name started and make that equal to false. So if the game has not started, so if not exclamation mark means not started, then we will do mini draw. And then we will make started equals true. After the first time the button is clicked, if it's not started because it's false, not false means true, then we will mini draw and then change started to true. So that next time the button's clicked, this will do nothing. And that is the start button and the next up display. All right, so I'll move it. I'll pass this off to Daniel for the last section.
All right. Now we only have the 9th section left, which is scoring the game in the 9th and final section. So if you guys can open up the section 9 files, and now we'll get started. All right, so as of now, we have added all the Tetris functions, such as next up. But if you were to start playing the game, you'll soon find that there is something wrong. As you can see, when you make a row, the colors does not disappear. So we need to fix that. So let's start. So in this add score function, we will be adding scores as well as removing any filled rows. So in order to do that, we need to find out when a row is filled and then add points to the score. So first off, we need to actually define, or at least reference this score. So we should, and remember that before we put in this span with an ID of score. And so it's very easy to actually change it. We just need to define that location. So over here by the other variables, we could put in a const, and we can call it score display. Score display, and that is document.query selector pound symbol, and not main grid, but it was before score. We will also need a variable to actually store the score. So we'll put a let score equals 0 there. All right, so now we could get started on the add score function. So how can we detect when a row is completely filled? Does anyone have any ideas? I actually can't see the chat. Okay.
Just to echo what Ishan said in the chat, maybe like when every index in the width is colored.
Yeah, that's a very good idea. And I guess that's how we are going to implement this. So, well, what we want to do is we want to check if each row is completely filled or colored. How we do that is we first start from the first row and we go down. When we check each row one at a time and see if they are taken. So let's first put a for loop for that, and we will iterate this. So I first created a for loop, and what that for loop represents is I represents the index of this grid of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, and so on. And then we add the width each time. So instead of going 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and so on, we go 1, 11, 21, 31, and so on. Then we will define a row array, which would be equal to I plus 1, I plus 2, and so on. I'll just copy and paste it. I plus 1, I plus 2, all the way to I plus 9. What this represents is when I is, I guess this is actually 0. That my mistake. So when this is 0, this const row would be 0, would represent this row. So 0 and I0 plus 1, which is 0, 1, and 0 plus 2, 0, 2. So it'll represent this row. And now we need to check if every single tile has a block in it. So how we do that is we do row.every. So this means we will check every single element in this array. And we'll put this function open index. So what will happen is so this every will call every single one, every single number in this array, then inputs it into this parameter. And we will use this to check, use the index inside of squares, which represents the entire grid, right? And we check if it's classless. So the div's class list has a taken class. So if every single tile in that one row has a taken class, that means this if statement will run. And what do we want it to do? We want it to increase the score because it's one completed row. So let's just add 10 to it because there's 10 blocks in each row. And then we will refresh the score. The score displays inner HTML, which basically means everything that's inside the two tags, the start and end tag. So it will just change the 0 to, I don't know, +10 or something, equals score. Then what we need to do is we also need to remove the colors as well. So then we do row dot for each. It means that for every single element in this array, we will run a function, and we will pass the value of that element, so like I and I+1, into a function that we shall make right now. What it will do is it will remove taken from the squares. So basically here, just copy and paste. Oops. Let's copy and paste this. And we will change, instead of contains, we will say remove. Removes taken. Then we will also need to remove any color that that tile has. So to do that, we write a for loop. And we will use the colors array, and we will get its length. Then we will iterate it. Iterate through every single color, so that if we have any of those colors, we will remove that. So copy paste, instead of remove taken, we'll just remove colors and .j for the colors index. All right, is everyone following along?
You misspelled colors.
Oh. Okay. All right, so this basically removes the taken and colors, but what will happen is that now it will be an empty space and all the other blocks will be floating on top of it. And that's not how Tetris works. So we need to remove that row and place it on top. So how do we remove that row? We can use a splice. So we will define a new variable called squares remove. This will be an array of this will be an array of all the blocks that we moved. Then what we will do is we will move it to the top. Or I should say, we shall move this thing, all the other non-filled rows below this. So what we can do is squares is equal to the spliced squares. And then we add in, and we concatenate the remaining square. So what will happen is in this line, we will remove this line, this row of empty tiles. Then we shall have this empty tiles be placed on top, then concatenate, which is basically just add. This empty row is placed on top, then all of this non-empty rows or non-infected rows will be placed underneath it, and that will be our new squares. Then what we also need to do is we need to refresh or update, sort of update the grid. So what we can do is, what we write is cell grid dot. And this line sort of just updates the grid, I guess. So that's basically it for scoring the game and removing any filled rows. Now let's also add a game over function, because we need to tell when the game and when the blocks has reached the top. So first off, we should create a game over screen. So let's go to variables, and remember we did make this and we wrote an ID of game end of Tetris. So what we can do is let's just write const game end is equal to document query selector, and now we'll use game end as our ID. Okay, so now how can we check if we have reached the top? Does anyone have any good ideas as to how we could check for like game over? Oh, okay. All right, so one way we could check for a game over is if we have to overwrite another tile. So for example, we do spawn in a tetronomo about here, and if we pile them up all the way up there, and we spawn in another one, it will intersect with okay. It will likely intersect with another a taken block. So what we can do is we can write if the current current dot sum is index and I'll explain this after I'm done writing. Ooh. Shoot. Okay, well, that was a mouthful. So what this basically means is that we have our current, which are, I believe, are the locations of the tetronomos. And what we do is we check if any of these intersect with another one, with another tetronomo. So if it sort of spawns in onto another one, then we can, if it does spawn in, we can say game is over. So game end dot inner HTML is equal to game over. Then we also need to stop the game. So we here need to clear the interval, the timer, and we say timer ID equal to null, just to make sure. If we have added music, then we should also pause that as well. So, and that's basically it. Oh, and one other thing is that we also need to check if it's game over or not. So how do we check it? We should check it after the block has landed. So when do we do that? Check it during freeze. So we could say add score to check if any blocks are, any rows are filled, as well as a game end. Oh wait, no, not game end, over. To check if we it rises too high. So let's save this and let's see if it runs. All right, so we have yellow, 3 yellows, a Z, and all right, now we could check if the bottom row disappears, and it does, and we have 10 plus 10 score. Now let's check if we have a game over, and if the game over function works. So we shall layer the blocks up, and there we go. The game is now over, and the game actually pauses. So that's basically it. Does anyone have any other questions? Feel free to put them in the chat or turn on voice chat.
So like I said in the chat, that's pretty much it for our workshop. If you guys want to stick around, I will put in the music for this game and show you how to do the volume controls. But other than that, you're free to leave now. A recording of this will be on our YouTube channel. If you have questions, like you're trying to make it on your own and you need troubleshooting, you can join our Discord server and ping me, or yeah, just computer chapter in general, I guess. And then we will respond to you pretty quickly. I think all of us are on Discord like all the time.